We don't take it for granted. We both started the day at Yad Vashem, the place that reminds us the wound that sits at the epicenter of the relationship between Germany and Israel. This relationship has been through a lot since the days of David Ben-Gurion and Adenauer, and they're stronger than ever. Together, we will deepen and widen them. Today, I'm happy to announce that the Chancellor and I have agreed to create a strategic cooperation between the two countries. It will be a biannual dialogue on security, statesmanship, and is due to give us a leap forward in our relationship. Mr. Chancellor, you come here in historic times and exciting times. We just talked about the situation in Ukraine and the duty that we have as leaders to do everything to stop the bloodshed and to move the activity from the battlefield into the negotiating table. It's not too late for that. Unfortunately, we have been through so many wars here in Israel. We know how pricey they are. This time it could be much worse. The state of Israel stands with the people in Ukraine. We have sent a lot of humanitarian equipment, 3 planes with 100 tons of equipment, and we are determined to continue and do so. Mr. Chancellor, it's also our duty to make sure that Iran does not have nuclear weapons and will not have the possibility to obtain nuclear weapons. Not in our shift and never. We worryingly follow the discussions in Vienna and the possibility for an agreement to be signed that would allow Iran within a few years to put in place the centrifuge that are necessary in order to create nuclear weapons. This is unacceptable. Israel would know to defend itself and protect its future and safety. We also expect our friends in the world not to agree to a situation of centrifuges being available within 2 or 2.5 years, and to be prepared for the day after. Mr. Chancellor, you have told me that you have 3 governments in your coalition. I have 8. You were kind to say how understanding you are of the situation, but having many parties is not necessarily a bad thing. It stands for a variety of opinions of different people, and the test we stand by as democracies is to work with different people with different approaches and opinions. The world as we know it is changing, the challenges are great, and we should be working together in order to face them together. I welcome you in Jerusalem, Mr. Chancellor. It's a short visit due to circumstances, but you insisted on coming, and we've already put so much content into our conversations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister. His Excellency.
Now the German Chancellor will be speaking and will be translating that for you.
I am very happy to be here in Israel. Thank you very much for the warm welcome and the good talks and the recommendations of how to lead a coalition with many partners. That's very important. It was very important for me personally to visit Israel as early as possible in my term. Despite the events going on in the world, I decided to do this visit, and it is right. It was also important to visit my visit in Jerusalem with a visit in Yad Vashem. The tour through Yad Vashem was very moving to me, and it clarified our German historical responsibility for the state of Israel. Germany will, and you can rely on that, stand also in the future on the side of Israel. In bilateral topics, we, of course, talked about the situation in Ukraine. The reports that reach us from Ukraine are terrible. We're very worried about the further development of the conflict, and everything needs to be done to change the situation. I want to call to stop all the fightings. Raids on civil infrastructure and civilians need to stop. And of course, now it is about giving a chance to diplomacy. And I'm very thankful that we both committed to that it's going to be possible that the talks between Ukraine and Russia will continue. Looking at our bilateral topics, I want to say I talked to Prime Minister Bennett. That we will invite the entire cabinet to government talks, and I'm happy that I got confirmation for that. And I'm very thankful for our agreement that we will establish a strategical dialogue between Israel and Germany that will take place systematically. And this is an important development in our relations, and it's of great significance. And we want to establish a German-Israeli youth institution in order to strengthen our relations. And we'll request to bring this issue forward so that we can discuss that and finalize that during our next talks. I thank you very much for your commitment and your work in strengthening our relations between Germany and Israel and to further develop them. We also talked about the relations of Israel to the European Union. The European Union is the most important commercial partner of Israel, and we have a brief cooperation and intense cooperations in science, and this is also what we want to strengthen in the future. And we talked about the relations of Israel with the Palestinian Authority. In the past months, there have been steps taken by the Israeli government to improve the living conditions on the ground, and I very much welcome that. I appreciate that. To prevent the new escalations, we need to show that there is development. It's not about concrete peace negotiations, but on both sides, people have the right to a life in security and dignity. A substantial solution, and I'm convinced, can only end in a two-state solution, which must be negotiated by both sides. But this is an issue for the future. We also talked about Iran and about the security situation. I want to say that we know the Israeli security concerns and we take them seriously, and they're equally important to us. One issue is important. We need to prevent that the Iran will get atomic weapons, nuclear weapons. This is our most important concern. This is a great danger for peace, and it is our task to ensure to prevent this. We're working on this together with our European partners and the USA. We don't know how things are going to turn out, but we are committed to prevent to prevent endangering Israel, and we're agreeing on this. We want to agree in Vienna because now is the time to reach a decision. We cannot postpone this any further. We cannot postpone this. Now is the point of time to say yes to something, to a good and responsible solution. I thank you very much, dear Naftali Bennett, for your hospitality. And I'm looking forward to our talks that we will have after this press conference.
Olaf Scholz, they're speaking in Jerusalem. There are a few questions in the crowd. A question there: what are the expectancies in Germany with regards to the number of refugees that might arrive from Europe, let's say, from Ukraine into Europe?
רוסיה, ואם יש גם כוונה למשל לספק נשק לאוקראינה.
Olaf.
We see that there are a lot of refugees who reach Europe, who reach the states of the European Union, and of course Germany as well. This is going to increase with the further escalation of the conflict. And therefore it is even more important that we commit to our task. We need to end this war. And we need to lead to peace talks which will deliver good results, and we need them to continue. We need the talks to continue, the talks which already began. Every day that this war continues will lead to destruction and will demand human lives of civilians and soldiers. And this is what we need to prevent together.
Our policy is measured and responsible, and we're thinking about all the various dimensions and considerations. First of all, as a country who itself has much experience, unfortunately, in war, we call for an immediate ceasefire in Ukraine, and we identify with the citizens that are under considerable danger and stress in Kiev, in Kharkov, in the south, and in other locations. We're helping and assisting Ukraine considerably. Just yesterday we sent over 3 airplanes filled with roughly 100 tons of medicine and other humanitarian aid. This is almost unprecedented amounts in Israel's history. We're working on more things in this context. First, trying to get out safely the Israelis. There's a meaningful Jewish community in Ukraine of helping and assisting Ukraine considerably. Just yesterday we sent over 3 airplanes filled with roughly 100 tons of medicine and
more weapons, as it announced until now. And this is a question that I want to dedicate to both of you. Zelensky is on the list. Putin wants to kill Zelensky. He's on his list. On which side are you going to position yourselves if a Jewish president gets murdered? And doesn't Germany and Israel have to warn Putin that there's going to be consequences if Zelensky won't survive this war?
So as I said, we have a very measured and responsible policy whose goal is to both help the Ukrainian people and do what we can to help alleviate some of the pressures and the consequences of this horrific situation. The Chancellor and myself discussed the practical help the people on ground and help bring this major crisis to a better outcome. Right, Olaf.
לקנצלר שולץ, אנחנו רואים שהצעדים הכלכליים והסנקציות על הרוסים לא מסייעים בשלב הזה.
Chancellor Scholz, we can see that the sanctions are not yielding much fruit in terms of the pressure on Russia. Do you think the West, the US and Europe should prepare for military action in Europe to block Russia? Also, what do you make of Israel's response? And last, what about the receiving
Thank you very much for the
refugees
question.
in Europe?
And I also want to refer to the other questions that were put forward earlier. This is a dangerous situation because this is a war between the biggest country of the world, and it's also one of the biggest countries of Europe, Russia. It's a superpower. It's a nuclear superpower. And the second biggest country of Europe, Ukraine. The Ukraine has more than 40 million inhabitants. We cannot underestimate the danger that is connected to this conflict. Therefore, our stance is clear. We will not act militarily. This refers to NATO. It won't do that. And also all the others. It would be wrong in this situation. But we support in the versatile ways that are available, with goods, with the other decisions that we took. But this is the decision that we took. And this is what we can do. The sanctions that we decided, they already influence, some of them already even before they took place. And this is showing that we decided the right thing. And we have the right stance between consequences and being careful. I think these are the right decisions. And we all agree that it's unacceptable that people are getting persecuted. That's unacceptable. Everybody knows that.
I think Chancellor Scholz's approach is both courageous and wise in a very delicate situation.
With regards to your question, I have spoken yesterday with the Minister of Interior, and we have agreed that our policy would be a policy of Beit Hillel, drawing from Chazal, an open mind.
Mr. Chancellor, you have just been to Yad Vashem in the Hall of Remembrance. There is also the name of Babia that's written on the floor, the place where Germans committed terrible crimes on Jews, and the site that was also hit by Russian aggression yesterday. What does that mean to you? Does Germany have a specific responsibility, a special one, because of the historic events? To Bennett, referring to Babia, what is your position on this? When does Israel reach red lines in this aggression war of Putin on Ukraine? When does Israel position itself? When does Israel act? And referring to the change in the German defense policy and the increase of the defense budget, how do you see that? How is this received in Israel?
Das war für mich heute sehr berührend.
That was very moving today for me personally, to be in Yad Vashem
Zweite Mal.
for the second time.
Und auch ein zweites Mal ist wie das erste Mal. Man
And the second time is like the first time.
das furchtbare
You
Verbrechen,
feel the terrible crime
vor allem von Deutschen, an den europäischen Juden.
that was committed first and foremost by Germans on the European Jews and on many, many more victims
Militärischen
of the German
Aggression.
military aggression.
Und aus dieser Geschichte erwächst eine
And out of this history, a specific responsibility is growing.
gegenüber dem Staat Israel,
A responsibility towards the state of Israel.
eine Verantwortung immer stark
A responsibility to always be strong against anti-Semitism worldwide.
und natürlich erwächst aus unserer Geschichte auch eine Verantwortung,
And out of our history, we have a responsibility to advertise for a peace order in Europe
denn das ist ja
without wars,
bittere
because this is the other
Geschichte,
bitter history,
Krieg in Europa,
that the war in Europe destroyed so many people.
ganz klare Aussage.
Therefore, our clear stance is
Muss immer
a European peace order always has to contain that the borders,
Souveränität
that the state's sovereignty and the integrity of states cannot be put on question.
I owe her an answer. First of all, Chancellor Scholz, seeing you at Yad Vashem, and I don't know if people realize, but you insisted, despite the visit having to be much shorter, you insisted that the visit to Yad Vashem remain full, and I couldn't help but seeing that not only your mind was there, but your heart, and I appreciate that. In Babi Yar, there was one of the worst massacres, and that was the harbinger of the final solution in the early stages, and we saw that just now, and the word that you used, and the word that the Chancellor used when we were talking about responsibility, and I believe regarding your question of military investment, which obviously it's sensitive. I'm not gonna, given the history, but I think Germany today, under your leadership, represents an anchor of stability, of leadership and responsibility in Europe. I think Israel represents an anchor of stability and responsibility in the Middle East. And I think that the new level of the bridge that we're forming between Germany and Israel is good news for the world, where we can bring more stability, more hope, more positivity in our regions and around. Thank you.
Press conference. Thank you, Prime Minister Bennett and Chancellor Scholz. Please remain seated until the leaders leave the room.
Chancellor of Germany, Olaf Scholz, in a first visit to Israel, reiterating, as he is expected to do, that Germany would not agree to Iran having nuclear weapons. Olaf Scholz saying it's our task to make sure that Iran does not have nuclear weapons. Now is the time to say yes to a good and responsible agreement. That's what he says. And obviously about Ukraine, many issues that come up with regards to the crisis in Ukraine due to the Russian invasion, from the refugee crisis. We know that almost 500,000 refugees have already made it from Ukraine into Eastern Europe.